my admiration for the late, great Jeff Beck. I shudder even saying those words.
There's something sacred about the moment a musician names the hands that shaped his own. When Joe Bonamassa speaks of his favorite guitar players, it's not a casual list. It's a quiet confession of gratitude, a map of the sounds that raised him, healed him, and taught him how to listen. Because for Joe, every note carries a lineage, and when he remembers his heroes, it's the same as tracing his own heartbeat. Born in 1977 in upstate New York, Joe Bonamassa was a prodigy who didn't just play the blues, he lived it. By the age of 12, he was opening for B.B. King, holding a guitar nearly as big as himself, yet already commanding it with startling maturity. Over the next 4 decades, Joe would tour relentlessly, breathe life into vintage tones, and become one of the few modern musicians to bridge the sacred gap between tradition and innovation. He isn't chasing fame, he's preserving a language that built him. So, when Joe Bonamassa finally revealed his 5 favorite guitar players, he wasn't ranking idols, he was naming his teachers. Number 1, Eric Johnson. The first name that escapes Joe's lips is spoken with something close to reverence, Eric Johnson. For most, Johnson is the virtuoso behind Cliffs of Dover, a song that sounds less like guitar work and more like sunlight made audible. But for Bonamassa, Eric Johnson represented something deeper, discipline, clarity, and the art of restraint. Joe first heard Johnson as a young teenager. He recalls pressing his ear to the speaker, rewinding the cassette until the tape hissed thin. What struck him wasn't just the melody, it was the precision, the patience. Johnson didn't play to impress. Every note had purpose, every silence had shape. Joe once said, "He's the only guitarist I've ever heard where every single note matters, even the space between them." That insight would shape everything Joe became. In an age of speed and spectacle, Eric Johnson taught him that mastery wasn't about how fast you could play. It was about how honest you could sound. Bonamassa learned to build tone the way a craftsman builds a cathedral, layer by layer, frequency by frequency, until it breathes on its own. When he speaks about Johnson, there's no distance, just awe. He calls him flawless, but not in the cold, technical sense. Flawless because the emotion never leaks. Because restraint, in Johnson's hands, feels like poetry. Joe once tried to learn Cliffs of Dover, note for note. He could play it, but he stopped halfway. "It didn't feel right," he said. "That was the day I realized that tone isn't technique, it's identity." And that lesson still echoes through every Bonamassa solo. The long, deliberate bends, the patient phrasing, the refusal to rush a note before it's ready. If you've ever heard Joe stretch a single tone until it feels like a prayer, that's Eric Johnson, speaking through him. Number 2, Stevie Ray Vaughan. The second name on Joe Bonamassa's list burns like fire through his memory, Stevie Ray Vaughan. If Eric Johnson taught him precision, Stevie taught him danger, the kind of playing that makes your heart race before your mind can catch up. Joe was still a boy when he first heard Texas Flood. He said it felt like the sky cracked open. The sound was raw, alive, and unpolished. Every bend a confession, every phrase a battle cry. Bonamassa didn't just admire Stevie, he studied him. He wore out cassette tapes trying to decode that storm of tone and emotion. What he discovered wasn't perfection, it was truth. Stevie's notes bled. His phrasing was reckless and pure, like he was dragging the blues back from the edge of extinction. "Stevie made the blues dangerous again," Joe once said. "He gave it teeth." At 11, Bonamassa tried to learn Scuttle Button. The notes came easily enough, but not the feel. "I nailed the timing," he remembered, "but the groove was missing. That's when I learned timing is mechanical. Groove is spiritual." Stevie's groove wasn't about tempo, it was about trust. He leaned into the beat like a man surrendering to gravity. And for Joe, that became a lesson not in playing, but in living, to let the music breathe, to let it fall sometimes. Through his teenage years, when practice rooms turned lonely and the road seemed endless, Joe said Stevie's music was his compass. Whenever he lost direction, he'd play Lenny or Tin Pan Alley and remember why he started. "If I ever forget what this is all about," Joe once said, "I put on Stevie, and I remember." He never met him, but you can feel Stevie's ghost in Bonamassa's phrasing. That mix of tenderness and rage, of precision wrapped in chaos. He still calls Vaughan the bridge between blues and rock, a man who made the genre dangerous, emotional, and divine all at once. To this day, Joe doesn't call Stevie Ray Vaughan the best blues guitarist. He calls him the most important. Because while others played the blues, Stevie became it. And for Bonamassa, that was the ultimate lesson. You don't perform the blues, you surrender to it. Number 3, Jeff Beck. If Stevie Ray Vaughan was the storm, then Jeff Beck was the lightning. Unpredictable, brilliant, and gone before you could name the shape of his strike. When Joe Bonamassa speaks of Beck, his tone changes. It slows, softens. Like he's describing something that can't really be captured, only felt. Beck, to Joe, was more than a guitarist. He was an explorer, a man who treated sound as a living thing. Beck didn't play solos, Joe once said. He had conversations with the guitar. And it's true. Every slide, every whisper of feedback, every pause felt alive, like the instrument itself was breathing through him. Bonamassa didn't try to imitate Jeff Beck. He tried to understand him. Because Beck's genius wasn't just in his fingers, it was in his defiance. No lyrics, no formulas, no hunger for fame, just endless curiosity. He could make a Telecaster weep, Joe said, and never raise his voice doing it. When Beck passed in 2023, Joe didn't release a statement or stage a tribute for the cameras. He did something simpler and more sacred. He stopped his tour mid-show and played, "Where Were You?" Quiet, unadorned, raw. The crowd fell silent. It wasn't performance, it was farewell. For Bonamassa, Beck represented the rare kind of artist who never stopped searching. Every album was a reinvention, fusion, funk, jazz rock. Beck refused to repeat himself. That restlessness became a guiding light for Joe, a reminder that mastery isn't a destination, it's a lifelong pursuit. In interviews, Joe often returns to one line. Beck didn't bend strings, he bent reality. That's the influence you can hear in Joe's own phrasing, those sudden turns, that refusal to resolve a note too soon. It's Beck's spirit of tension and release, of always leaving something unsaid. Joe calls Jeff Beck the most important guitarist to listen to, because listening to Beck isn't passive. It changes you. It teaches you to fear silence less, and to treat sound as something sacred. In the quiet corners of Bonamassa's music, between the flash and fire, there's always a hint of Beck's restraint, proof that the loudest truth is often whispered. Number 4, Danny Gatton. The fourth name, Joe Bonamassa, speaks with a kind of awe, almost a whisper, Danny Gatton. For most, the name drifts beneath the mainstream, but for players who know, Gatton was the humbler, the man who could outplay anyone, and never cared if you noticed. Joe calls him the best guitarist you've never heard of. Bonamassa first discovered Gatton through a bootleg cassette when he was barely a teenager. The tape was rough, uneven, and recorded live in some Maryland bar. But what came through the speakers didn't sound human. Gatton's fingers blurred, switching from jazz to country to blues in a single breath. It was like watching someone perform brain surgery with barbecue sauce, Joe once said with a grin. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Beautifully. When Joe finally met him, he was just 11 years old, small, shy, clutching his Les Paul. Gatton didn't treat him like a prodigy. He treated him like a peer. He showed Joe tricks, finger rolls, the art of volume swells that sounded like a pedal steel. No ego, no lecture, just music passed hand to hand. It was the first time Bonamassa felt the quiet brotherhood of guitarists who play for love, not applause. Joe spent months trying to mimic Gatton's style, but no matter how hard he practiced, something was missing. "I could play the notes," he said, "but not the soul." That realization became one of his most painful and powerful lessons. That genius isn't something you learn, it's something you listen to. Gatton wasn't chasing recognition, he was chasing purity. But that purity came with loneliness. The industry didn't know where to put him. Too technical for blues, too soulful for rock. He played bar gigs, fixed cars by day, and quietly made history no one was watching. When he took his own life in 1994, Joe was devastated. He often mentions him on stage, not to mourn, but to remember. "Danny Gatton showed me that talent isn't enough," Joe once said. "You also need peace." Today, when Bonamassa performs those quick chicken-picking runs or subtle country slides, You can still hear Gatton's fingerprints, the quiet craftsman whose music never shouted but somehow filled the room. Number 5, B.B. King. If the others were teachers, B.B. King was Joe Bonamassa's father in the blues. Their paths crossed in 1990 when Joe was 12 years old, a boy in a too large blazer, nervously tuning his guitar before the great man himself. B.B. didn't see a child. He saw a spark. He called Joe on stage, handed him space, and changed his life forever. That night wasn't just a performance, it was a baptism. Joe later said, "I met B.B. King on May 24th, 1990, and it changed everything." The lesson began before a single note was played. B.B. didn't move fast, didn't fill the silence. He let each note bloom, then fade, like a conversation with God. And in that space, young Joe learned what no scale or speed exercise could teach: that 2 notes played with intent can strike deeper than 100 played perfectly. King became Joe's mentor and compass. They toured together for more than 20 shows. Night after night, Joe would stand side stage, watching B.B. draw tears with one bend, one smile, one moment of patience. He noticed how King never forced the guitar. He coaxed it. And off stage, B.B. was just as generous. No preaching, no criticism, only warmth, laughter, and quiet stories about life on the road. Bonamassa has said that just hearing B.B. King laugh backstage taught him more about stage presence than any lesson could. "He showed me how to speak through the guitar," Joe recalled, "without raising your voice." When B.B. passed in 2015, Joe didn't just mourn him, he carried him forward. He built entire tours around his legacy, rearranged set lists to honor him, and still calls him the Blueprint. You can hear it in every slow blues Joe plays. The phrasing that waits, the tone that breathes, the humility between the notes. That's B.B. King living through him, the eternal reminder that the blues isn't about sorrow, it's about honesty. For Joe Bonamassa, B.B. wasn't merely a legend, he was home. Listening to Joe Bonamassa speak these names, Johnson, Vaughan, Beck, Gatton, King, you realize he isn't just paying tribute, he's revealing the map of his soul. Each of these men represents a different truth about artistry: precision, courage, freedom, humility, and grace. Together, they form the foundation of Joe's identity, not just as a guitarist, but as a custodian of a tradition that refuses to die. For him, these aren't just influences, they are voices that live in his fingers. Every solo he plays is a conversation with his past, a thank you whispered through 6 strings. Decades later, Joe Bonamassa still carries the same quiet reverence he felt as that 12-year-old boy standing beside B.B. King. Fame has never changed his compass. He still speaks about tone as if it's a sacred language, something you don't own, only borrow for a while. In every concert, you can feel echoes of those 5 men: Johnson's clarity, Vaughan's fire, Beck's curiosity, Gatton's craftsmanship, and King's heart. Because in Joe's world, greatness isn't about volume or virtuosity. It's about truth, the kind that vibrates through your chest and stays long after the music fades. And if you've ever sat alone with a record spinning slow, letting one note say everything words can't, you already understand him. Joe Bonamassa's reverence for these 5 players cements him as more than a blues revivalist. He's the living bridge between eras. His choices reflect a generation's transition from analog honesty to digital perfection, reminding us that tone, feel, and human imperfection are the eternal soul of music. In an age of speed, he's proof that restraint still moves mountains. B.B. King didn't just open the door for me, he handed me the key and told me to walk through. Joe Bonamassa.